Hauser, and I'm honored to serve this year as president of the Alameda League of Women Voters. On behalf of the League, we want to welcome you to this evening's forum. Relieving the housing crisis in Alameda and the region, what can we do? Your host, the League of Women Voters, is a nonpartisan political organization. We neither support nor oppose any political party or candidate at any level of government. We organize forums like this one to promote the informed and active participation of citizens in government. I would like to thank the Alameda Housing Authority and Kathleen Mertz, Director of Housing and Community Development, and Richard Yoshida, who's here tonight, for hosting us and letting us have this wonderful space. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention where the exits are in case there's an emergency. Looks like both sides of the room there are exits, and if you need a restroom, it's out to the right, and then to make a left turn. Sponsoring informative forums on complex and controversial topics like housing also requires money. For instance, you're hearing my soft voice amplified by a rented sound system. You can encourage us to continue sponsoring forums like this by placing a few dollars in the donation box at the back of the room where Sally is sitting. And one admonition, please, no video or audio recording of any of the speakers here tonight or of this event. We are recording it, having it recorded, and it will be, the full forum will be available on our website. Our moderator for this evening will be Karen Butter, Chair of the League of Women Voters Action Committee.
Thanks, Susan, and welcome everybody to the forum this evening. Thank you for your interest in relieving Alameda's and the region's housing crisis. As of this week, polling indicates that the housing crisis has made, for the first time ever, homelessness the #1 concern of adults living in California, especially in Los Angeles and here in the San Francisco Bay Area. While recently Alameda has met targets set by regional planners for more expensive homes, it has not met them for affordable homes. As the legislature moves the planning process from setting voluntary targets to enforcing mandates for new homes, what more can Alameda do to build the affordable homes allocated to it by regional planners? Perhaps for the city of Alameda, consisting of an island and a peninsula with limited access, the growth target for the next decade could be either more jobs nor more neither more jobs nor more homes. Perhaps the city could remove its ban on multifamily housing, the 1973 Measure A, from the charter. Perhaps the city could build homes on all of its surplus publicly owned lands. Perhaps Alameda residents could build more granny units on existing lots. Perhaps. So we have, the panelists who will discuss these options and more include regional experts, Ms. Xiomara Cisneros of the Bay Area Council from the business community. Regrettably, Ezra Rappaport, formerly the executive director of ABAG, the Association of Bay Area Governments, which sets jobs and housing targets for cities, was unable to attend tonight. But his perspective on regional housing goals helped guide the selection of topics for the forum. One panelist, Mr. Joe Ernst, has successfully entitled, financed, and completed 4 attractive commercial facilities in Alameda, including VF Outdoor and others throughout the Bay Area. His firm, SRM Ernst, is part of Alameda Point Partners, a joint venture which recently broke ground on 600 market rate homes and 10,000 square feet of commercial space at Alameda Point's Site A. 2 panelists represent nonprofit developers, Mr. Luis List of Eden Housing, which is building 130 affordable homes in Alameda Point Site A. The Reverend Sophia Dewitt of the East Bay Housing Organizations supports regional policies that promote affordable housing. We've provided you with a bio of all of the panelists, including Mr. Rapport, who could not make it tonight. We have also provided you, or will provide you, with cards and a pencil you can use to write down questions for our panelists. We'll collect your questions during the brief short presentations by the panelists and during the following Q&A. League of Women Voters housing activist Sally Fallhaber will sort and pass on selected questions. On your question card, please indicate which panelist to ask your question of. Before we begin our Q&A, each of the panelists will take 5 to 10 minutes to discuss either why or how housing targets, including Alameda's, are set by the state, or an example of one project that partially fulfills those targets. First, excuse me, our housing panelist, Ms. Xiomara Cisneros, will explain why the business community supports housing targets for regions and cities. Ms. Cisneros?
Hi, I'm Xiomara Cisneros with the Bay Area Council. And before I address the question of why we endorse having certain thresholds and targets in terms of jobs and housing in the region, I'll just explain a little bit more about the Bay Area Council. We are a public policy advocacy organization for the 9-county Bay Area, representing 101 cities. And we are a member organization. Our members, 350 members actually, are some of the biggest businesses and larger employers. They run the gamut from tech, computing, housing industry, et cetera, you name it. We have them as our member pretty much. And for us, it's our mission and our duty to advocate for a strong business environment, but also have a strong quality of life for everyone here in the region. And for that reason, housing again and again and again ranks as #1 issue for our membership. And so that's where I come in. We have a staff of about 30, and I and another staff person focus solely on housing. And we do that on the local, regional, and state level. And it's important because if we are not aiming towards a high goal, then we're going to continue to fail again and again. And if anything, what we've learned in the past few years is that there's this angst in our region, and that's because we've been continuing to fail these targets. And that's why you hear policymakers in the state level in Sacramento starting to wield the cudgel, you could say. And there's discussions about a carrot and stick approach with addressing these housing targets. And you know, the population is going to grow whether we like it or not. We have to expect 2 million more people within the next couple of decades. And where are they going to go? So we can't restrict. We can't push people out of our communities. We have to be mindful and plan for them. And the best way to do that is through having a thoughtful process, which we'll talk about later on with the RHNA number, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And I think that's pretty much addresses the questions.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Joel Ernst. He's a principal of commercial developer, SRM Ernst, as I said earlier. He will explain the years-long timelines required to entitle. Maybe he will. Required to entitle, permit, finance, and build mixed-use projects that include housing. He will illustrate the timelines with his Site A development at Alameda Point. Mr. Ernst.
Thank you. Happy to be here. You know, as a commercial developer, I am a commercial developer, but I also live in this community, and it's, you know, hard for me to see people, hear stories about people getting evicted due to high rents, to see people homeless on the street. So I'm a housing advocate for that, but also as a commercial developer around economic development. You know, I think they are very related, and so, you know, promoting more to support our economic development goals. You know, with regard to Site A, many of you may be familiar with the project. You know, 68-acre site, has a total of 800 homes, up to 100,000 square feet of retail in the first 2 phases, 15 acres of parks. We're delivering a new ferry terminal as part of the project. The big thing is the $100 million of infrastructure improvements that are necessary to support both the Site A itself, but to be a hub for the rest of the naval base development, contributing money to sports complex and other infrastructure as part of the project. For this project, our entitlement process was unique in that the city had already invested many months, if not years, in coming up with a specific plan for Alameda Point. We took that plan and quickly developed a plan to comply with that plan. But that whole process, if you add those together, happened over many years, happened over 5+ years. Well, we go through a lot of economic changes during that time. Other markets have impact, and so a lot can change as these plans are evolving. For us, the biggest challenge has been costs. We've been in a hyperinflationary market, and we're trying to balance, how much density, how much value can we derive from the product we have to build, and use that value to pay for the infrastructure improvements. And for several years, as it impacted our ability to get started, was trying to balance that equation and trying to figure out how to look at different financing structures to maximize the value. And I think a lot of folks want to say that we got free land as part of developing, but that free land came with the $100 million of infrastructure improvements. We have a full project labor agreement. We have $10 million contributed to the ferry, $5 million for a sports complex, 15 acres of park, the offsite improvements, and a laudable 25% affordable housing commitment. And so these are all things that I live in Alameda, these are all things we want for our community, but they do put pressure on a development and building housing, and we have to, again, balance those as we determine what do we want to see in our housing product, and then how does that housing help promote economic development and jobs. Something we may get to talk about later is, the whole notion of the business park has changed, and how we recruit jobs and how we recruit entertainment and restaurants has a big impact on whether we build homes and what type of homes we build. So, thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Louis Liss from Eden Housing. Mr. Liss will describe the tortuous process required to finance 80 units of affordable housing soon to be constructed at Site A. Mr. Liss?
So it's 130. We have 130 units, and it is so many that we have to split it into 2 buildings and ask everybody who has money twice. Sometimes even more, sometimes 3 times, but I'll get to that. So first, I'm Louis Liss. I'm a project developer with Eden Housing, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about Eden. We're a 51-year-old organization that owns over 10,000 units of affordable housing. And as it turns out, we love TOD in the suburbs. We're active around many of the BART stations out here in the East Bay. And so an opportunity to get into Alameda Point and be near a new ferry-oriented development was such a win for us. So we got on this team in 2014 and have been working diligently to get to the place where we are today with one of the buildings coming out of the ground. So Alameda Point Family and Senior are the 2 buildings that are going up on Block 8 of the redevelopment that Joe has been working on as well. So one will be for seniors, 60 units with 28 of them for veterans exiting homelessness. And then the second building will be 70 units for families, and a significant number of those apartments will be for people exiting homelessness as well. So you've probably seen, if you've been around the Site A area, the senior building started in March of 2019, this year. I know, it's happened so fast. It's like, how long has it even been? And then the family building is slated to start in the second quarter of next year. And my hope, personally, is to get the family building started before the senior one wraps up. But that depends on several challenges that I wanted to talk about. So as Joe mentioned, we are in a crazy cost environment. I crunched a lot of numbers because that's my job. And as it turns out, the senior building is costing $603,000 per unit, all in. Yeah, it's really steep. And so where a market rate developer would be able to generate all that value and then turn around and sell it and pay back their construction loan. So what happens for us is our tenant rents, the actual money that's coming from people who are living in the building is only 5% of the cost of building it. So everything else has to come from subsidies, it has to come from the county, it has to come from the state, and it also comes from the low-income housing tax credit program, which is a whole thing we could talk about over beer sometime. I made a handy little list of all of the funding that we've applied for on both buildings. I thought it would be fun, and it was. I think I've submitted something like, 6 or 7 applications, and I've only been with the project for 1.25 years. We have applied for county money. We've applied for money through the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco, I believe multiple times. We've applied to the state for their veteran homelessness and housing prevention program. We have applied to the Housing Authority probably 3 times for operating support. We've applied to the state for cap and trade money 3 times. We've applied to the state for infill infrastructure grant money twice, but maybe a third, we'll see. We've applied to the No Place Like Home program that was approved through Proposition 2. And we've applied for tax credits 3 times, but only on the senior building, not yet on the family building. So I think that is something like, 20 times we've applied for funding. So the quote from our fearless leader at Eden, Linda Mandolini, is it takes multiple swings to get an affordable housing project funded. So we're going to keep swinging, and we're so close on family. We probably have a little bit, like 10% out of the 100 left to try to get funded. So that's what I'm going to be working on for the next few months, and hopefully we'll be able to see a second building coming out of the ground soon.
Thank you. And our final speaker, but certainly not our last speaker, is Reverend Sophia Dewitt, and she will review the progress that Alameda is making towards satisfying its regional target for housing and explore legislative and other options for shortening timelines and reducing the cost of building affordable homes in Alameda. Reverend Dewitt?
Good evening. It's nice to be here. My name is Reverend Sophia Dewitt. I serve as Program Director at East Bay Housing Organizations. East Bay Housing Organizations is a 35-year-old membership and advocacy organization working to create, preserve, and protect affordable housing opportunities, especially for low-income communities in the East Bay. That includes both Alameda and Contra Costa counties. So we work all across both counties of the East Bay on local, especially local, but also regional and statewide policy solutions that can help to produce more affordable homes, preserve the affordable homes that we currently have so that we're not losing those to speculation in the private market and price rises and those kinds of things, and also protecting tenants where they are currently through encouraging local jurisdictions to pass various kinds of tenant protections that can safeguard folks from large rent increases or evictions, harassment, different kinds of things like that. We really believe that the housing crisis that the Bay Area is experiencing is, well, we all know it's very big. It's one of the most significant challenges that this region faces. And because of its size and its urgency and its importance, we believe that we need a myriad of solutions to help solve the issues that we're facing. So we definitely need more affordable homes. And so we need more production of affordable homes. And we have, as I said, we're a membership organization. Our membership includes the major affordable housing developers here in the East Bay. Eden Housing is one of our long-time members. Yay for Eden. But we also have, individual community residents who are concerned about the affordable housing issue who are members with us. We have communities of faith that want to be engaged in issues around housing affordability. And we also do some community organizing work with residents of affordable housing to make sure that they understand what the issues are and that they know how to speak to their local policymakers, whether it's the City Council in Alameda or the Alameda County Board of Supervisors or folks in Walnut Creek and Concord about what they need and what they'd like to see in their community. So we believe in a broad range of solutions, so definitely production, but as I said, we also work on preserving currently existing affordable housing, and we work on tenant protections. So we're very much about the 3 Ps of housing, which has become a phrase that is popular, not just here in the region, but also at the statewide level, and I think helped to pass a number of the big housing bills that recently passed out of the legislature and that are currently on the governor's desk, awaiting his potential signature, and we can talk about those as potential solutions a little bit later on this evening. So for us, yes, policy, we focus on policy, we focus on organizing, and we focus on broad solutions. And this issue of housing is obviously important to me in my professional work, but when we talk about this issue specific to Alameda, it is particularly important to me because I'm also an Alameda resident. And so I want to see this community, which is a wonderful community, be strengthened and be a good home for people from all sectors of the community, all incomes, all life stages. And I think that'll make us an even more vibrant community and an even more wonderful place to live. So I'm happy to be here tonight, and I look forward to further conversation and questions.
Thank you, Reverend Dewitt. A couple comments following up on Reverend Dewitt's comment about living in Alameda. 3 of our panelists actually do live in Alameda, so they are also very interested in the solutions. And we're also very pleased to welcome our mayor, Marilyn Ashcraft, and our new city manager, Eric Levitt. Those of you who haven't met Eric, I encourage you to go up and say hi. So with that, we will go ahead and start the question part of it. Let me find the questions. So the first question that I want to ask is to Ms. Cisneros. I've got a statement to make. So I'm very skeptical about the Bay Area Council's plans for the Bay Area. I think the major cause of our housing problem is the imbalance between jobs and housing. It seems to me the BAC plan is for ever more economic employment growth without regard for the environmental consequences. The BAC worships endless economic growth that primarily benefits the moguls that live in Woodside and other enclaves. How does the housing shortage for working people affect businesses?
Thank you for the question. Not aggressive at all. And, I'll just give myself some street cred. I also live in Alameda, so Alameda resident. And I actually agree with a couple of elements of that statement where there is a huge jobs housing imbalance. And, it's like a blessing and a curse that we're such a huge economic engine here in the region. Like, the world is jealous of us. Our perspective is that we should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We have this social compact where, businesses do business. We are in a capitalist society, and residential builders should be able to develop residential. But unfortunately, we've put this artificial cap on housing with, unfortunately, things like CEQA, which the California Environmental Quality Act, which is intended to protect our environment, but has been abused, unfortunately, and has been used as a tool to basically stop housing development. And the other piece to that statement was our concern for the environment, and I can't think of a better way to protect our green belt and our open spaces than encouraging infill development, having housing in the right places where there's existing infrastructure, where there's transit. So the project Site A is a really great example of that. And it is just, again, unfortunately, the California Environmental Quality Act is having the unintended consequence of not allowing housing in the right places, making it cheaper to do it out in the outlying spaces, greenfield development. So Solano County and the outlying regions are unfortunately very appealing to builders and are hurting our beautiful fields and forests, etc. And then the other piece I wanted to address is how's the housing shortage affecting working people and businesses? We're actually hearing more and more from our members how they can't retain their workers. A lot of their employees are being pushed out, and it's making their commute unbearable, and they're seeing less of their families. And so they're looking at other jobs outside of the Bay Area, outside of California. And when it comes to recruitment, they start looking for a home, and the job sounds great with the $100,000 salary, but as soon as they see the rent costs and the housing costs, we're like, well, let's stay here in Texas. So, eventually we're going to kill the golden goose here if we continue at the pace that we're going by saying not building homes for our workers, for our employees. And I hope that addresses all the comments.
Any comments from other panelists about the question? Okay.
I would agree
Go
that
ahead, Joe.
CEQA has abused or has been abused to block housing, but I think CEQA also has created a problem that's very near and dear to our hearts, and that's traffic. And I think the way CEQA has been structured has promoted more traffic because it makes the roadway systems, the parking requirements, to support more cars in order to get a development project approved. And so that has taken away from the catalyst or the incentive to develop more robust transit systems. And so now we, under this rule that's been designed to protect us, has actually created a bigger problem for us as we go forward with development.
Okay. Go ahead.
I'll just say one thing quickly. While clearly there are problems, some problems with CEQA, there's problems with any law that we might pass as a society because we can't get things perfect. There are benefits as well to CEQA, including around development processes, particularly when you're talking about communities that have been disenfranchised or have felt themselves disenfranchised and have less access to the political process, et cetera, like that. CEQA can often be a tool for those communities to slow down a development project, yes, but to make sure that certain community benefits are included in a project, that the project really meets the needs of the surrounding community, particularly those communities that have been most impacted negatively in the past by some kinds of development. So yes, there have been abuses to CEQA. There have been ways in which the anti-development of all kinds forces have used CEQA to stop projects in ways that might not be beneficial, but there also have been benefits. So, this is another situation where I think EBHO kind of sits in the middle and sees both sides of a particular issue, and we wouldn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak.
I would actually, to build on that, I think that, I think that when you think about something as nebulous as CEQA and development standards, it's really interesting to think about what it looks like from the ground level. So in a building like we're building at Alameda Point, we're having to include parking in the building. And because we are building the number of units we're building to the height that we're allowed on the very small footprint, we're having to put that parking inside the building, inside a concrete podium. Concrete is like $1,000 an ounce. It's so expensive. And land, well, they're not making anymore. So, big picture, there's volcanoes, that's true. Big picture, having brakes and gas pedals on development is important, but when you get down to the project level, you can really live and die by exactly what rules are being put into the project, and it has a very big impact on how many units you build and what it's going to cost.
Thank you. So let's go on to our next question. This is for Reverend Dewitt. Our affordable housing goal through 2023 is 975 units. The city is primarily relying on market rate builders by requiring 15% affordable housing, for which they get a substantial density bonus, which allows them to build even more market rate housing, thus reducing the yield to 12.5%. At this rate, we will have to build almost 8,000 units to yield the 975. Is this really feasible? Is it not creating a scarcity of available sites for affordable housing?
Gotta love these compound questions. There's several issues here involved in this question, and I'll try to address them one by one, but briefly. First of all, I think there's an assumption built into the question, possibly, that market rate development or relying on inclusionary zoning for the development of affordable units means that you're not getting very much, or you're basically mostly just getting market rate. Often with a market rate project, as is the case with the Site A project, a market rate developer will reserve a significant part of the land for affordable development. So as a Site A, we're getting quite a number of units there. So that's one thing. But I will say that obviously the city of Alameda, in its need to often rely on inclusionary zoning for the development of affordable housing, one of the reasons that is so is because there are very limited sites available here on the island and the Bay Farm Peninsula for development, and a large region for that is Measure A, and the restrictions that Measure A puts on the development of multifamily housing. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult and it has to be worked around if you want to build multifamily housing. So at some point in the future, the voters, the residents of Alameda may want to consider either removing the Measure A restriction or modifying the Measure A restriction. The other reason that inclusionary housing is such a particular tool for the city of Alameda is that, as we've already talked about, the construction of additional affordable homes is very expensive. And it takes a lot of different funding sources, and there isn't a large funding source here in Alameda on a citywide basis to help the developer, to help the affordable housing developer build that new housing and to match those local funds with state funds or county funds, etc. So what some other cities in the region have done is looked at local funding measures that use various ways of funding, have different amounts, target amounts. So that might be something for the city and the residents and the voters to consider at some point as well. In terms of building more housing, but it makes sense why the city of Alameda at this point relies so much on their inclusionary housing program, because there are a number of constraints that the city's dealing with.
Anybody else want to comment?
So I'm a big fan of just providing flexibility to the developer. So whether it's the inclusionary policy or paying an in lieu fee or opting for a land dedication to work with an affordable housing developer, I think that could ultimately result in more affordable housing units. I would love everyone else's opinion on that, but it seems that providing choices could perhaps have a stronger yield, and I'm not sure if this is quite the case in Alameda, but I believe that the in lieu fee only applies for smaller multifamily developments. And I also just wanted to address a comment. I'm not sure if everyone here would agree with me, but there are finite sources for subsidized below market rate housing, and so that's why I totally agree that we are creating an exclusionary community by restricting the zoning and with policies like Measure A. And that's why it's so difficult to do affordable housing here. So if that were to be amended or lifted, then it could create that much more opportunities to increase housing production. I just also think that generally speaking, we need housing production at all levels of affordability. Right now we're creating a bidding war, and these homes that are perhaps intended for middle or lower income people or families are instead being taken by higher income people or families. And that's again because of us restricting the supply.
Yeah, I'd like to just add to that, I'm a commercial developer, we entitle housing, but my company doesn't build it. And so it's been quite a learning for me, watching the Eden folks and what they have to go through to capitalize a project. And I don't think that model is sustainable long-term. I don't think it's going to solve our problem. We have so much demand, we need supply. I think supply is truly the way, again, at all types of housing, is how we are ultimately able to build housing affordable at all levels, or have existing housing be available and affordable at all levels. But until we address supply, this problem's not going to go away. And the sources, I applaud these guys for the work they do in pulling these sources together. It's an amazing where it comes from, but it's tough. It's not sustainable.
So I have a couple of questions for Mr. Liss that I'm going to put together. So first one is, Alameda needs to double the number of affordable housing units it adds each year to meet its RENA goals, and you might want to explain what RENA is. Are existing funding sources capable of supporting this higher rate of construction? That's one question. Another question is, what are some of the major drivers of cost in building affordable projects like yours? Can any of those drivers be mitigated in a meaningful way?
Okay, that was so many questions. I'm going to do my best. How many units of low-income housing was it for RENA?
I don't have it here.
It was like hundreds?
So the state, well, here's the.
Real time, everyone.
Here's the current, I have the current RENA numbers with me. For Alameda, this RENA period started in 2014.
Could you read
Okay, all right, I'm looking at the chart, and the answer is no. There's not enough money. I feel like everyone's doing my job for me, telling how hard it is because there's really not enough money.
Just one question. Does everybody know what RENA is? No. Okay, could you explain it, or could somebody explain it?
Yes.
Sure, I knew we would get to RENA at some point. RENA stands for the Regional Housing Needs Allocation Process, and that is a process that works in a couple different steps. First, the state of California, HCD, that's the Housing and Community Development Department, a department of our state, figures out what the total housing need will be over an 8-year period for the Bay Area, based on the use of a whole bunch of complicated factors, have to do with population growth, job growth, whole bunch of things. It was like 6 or 7 or 10 factors. They come up with a region-wide Bay Area number. They give that number, at least in the past, they've given that number to the Association of Bay Area Governments, otherwise known as ABAG. There's so many acronyms in this work. And ABAG then figures out what the allocations need to be for each city in the Bay Area, and all the unincorporated areas of the counties. And they also figure out, so they give a total number of units needed. In this current RENA period that started in 2014 and goes through 2022, the total number of units needed in Alameda
City.
Alameda City, not Alameda County, was 1,723. Then ABAG further figures out what, among those units, how many need to be very low income. That's for families and individuals making up to 50% of the area median income. How many need to be low income? That's for families making up to 80% of area median income. Moderate income units up to 120%, or above moderate income units above 120%. And they figure out the allocations for each city and unincorporated area of the county, and the income allocations by putting together a methodology committee that examines all of these different factors, has to look at how we affirmatively further fair housing. That means we don't want to concentrate certain racial or economic populations in one particular city or one particular part of the county. They have to look at where the jobs are being created or will be created in the next 8 to 10 years versus where the housing units are. They look at various economic conditions. They look at where the transit investments are located, whole bunch of things to come up with these numbers. So it's a complicated process. It's about to get started again for the Bay Area. The Regional Methodology Committee, which includes local elected officials and community advocates and a diverse range of folks that apply and are selected. That committee has just been selected, that methodology committee, and they will meet very shortly to begin their process in the next few weeks. That'll probably take about a year and a half, and then the cities will have their RHNA numbers for the next RHNA cycle.
So thank you, Dr. Dewitt.
You're very welcome. I'm sure everyone followed every bit of what I said.
Now, moving back to the original question.
So there's not enough. I did a back of the envelope calculation, and we need to build 700 very low and low income units in 8 years. At about $750,000 a unit, taking into account what it actually costs and maybe escalation, but maybe costs will go down. So about today's price. And then I divided it by 2. So with the 700 by 750K, that's $500 million in housing development, just for low and very low income in Alameda. And then based on how affordable housing projects gets financed, you need about half of that money to be basically cash from the state or the local government. So that's $262 million over the 8 years that would have to come from the local, the county, the city, the state to be able to finance all of that housing. So based on my current assessment, there is not enough.
So the other part of the question is, can any of part of the question was, what are some of the major drivers in the cost of building projects? Can any of those drivers be mitigated in any meaningful way?
That's a great question. So part of it is cyclical. When construction gets really busy, all the workers have their luck to be able to pick the jobs they want to go on, and they can raise their price because they're more scarce. So part of it is cyclical. Part of it is that building technologies have not really evolved particularly significantly in the past, 100, 200, yeah. So hoping for technology, big save on that. A lot of people are interested in modular construction. That's like a really cool idea. It doesn't really pencil yet, but we're gonna keep trying because that's exciting. But ultimately, when you're building a building, you're paying so many people that have to pay rent and that have families to come onto your site at like 7 in the morning and toil all day. And the fact of the matter is these people have to come from somewhere in the Bay Area or maybe outside. I know that we have people who commute from the Central Valley on a regular basis just to work on our projects. So it's a little bit of a vicious cycle. So we're hopeful for technology. We're hopeful that we can create an environment where construction work can be, less expensive.
Joe, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say, in my 20 plus years doing this, we've been through a number of down cycles and really don't see costs materially going down in the downswing of an economic cycle. We may see contractors squeeze profit margins. We may see improvements in productivity or efficiency, but whether the prices of commodities, when you look at the whole pool of cost, something's always up, something's always down. Again, labor rates, the rates themselves rarely go down, if ever. And so you actually find a window there, though, where contractor margins are down, contractor availabilities are good, and so you can get more efficiencies, but you're in a down market, so the lenders won't lend, and the capital is waiting to get on the other side of that down cycle. So it's hard to match up when you find yourself in that window where you have some less pressure on costs to find the necessary capital to execute.
And just to add to that, I will say that it doesn't mean that we don't try on the design side to squeeze money out. So I'm looking at my $50 million budget for the family project. And as it turns out, you basically burn out all of your architects and your designers, squeezing out $50,000 at a time. So we really, really try to get the cost down. It's just really tricky, as Joe described.
I know, working on projects before I retired, that you'd get into a down cycle, and then you'd find out that the steel prices, which were coming from China, were, delayed 6 months, which was going to throw everything off cycle, and then you don't know what things were going to look like in 6 months. So it's a tricky game. Now, hopefully, a little bit easier question, and as part of that, I wanted to point out an article in the Alameda magazine called Mall Makeover, Jamestown's plans to build 1,215 housing units at South Shore. And this question relates to that, and it's just for the panel in general. Can the city of Alameda require affordable housing as part of the development at South Shore Mall?
Yes.
If it does, you can send them to us.
Anybody want to?
No, go ahead.
I mean, of course, the city can require it. It's the city, can establish its own requirements. And, again, not speaking as a housing developer, but I think having some obligation or goal to build affordable housing is necessary if we're going to keep up with this model. But we just have to balance that with everything else, the other demands on a project, and really establish priorities. And, do we want 15 acres of parks with that? Do we want contributions to sports complexes? Do we want project labor agreements? All of these have to be balanced because there's only so much a project can support.
And I'll just quickly add to that, it's all about balance, exactly as Joe stated. And, when you start layering all these various elements for a community benefits package, it's maybe a certain percentage of inclusionary and the PLA or what have you, you're going to end up with nothing. So we're at the most dire housing shortage of our lifetimes, and that's the last thing we want to do is just have a project have to fulfill all these promises and commitments and end up with 0 homes. So that's just something for us to all think in mind when we come to the community and talk about that balance of community benefits and actually delivering homes.
Okay. Next question for Mr. Ernst. What can the city of Alameda do to enable projects like yours to be completed more quickly without sacrificing safety and environmental damage? Or it should be, can the city do anything?
The city can definitely do things. Time is money, and the length of time it takes to get these projects approved is very expensive. A lot of the capital, expense and the capital committed is on the front end, and the value derived is on the back end. And the longer that period is, the more expensive it gets. But I think objective standards. I think, as a developer, if I could, the ideal would be a peer checklist approach. If I do this, and this, my project's approved. I go in for one hearing. I know what I have to build. The projects, I do meet all that, and I can go build my project. And I think the community needs to develop standards. I think that our boards can apply to projects, and so that needs to be a process, I think, where the community has to really be involved, establish a set of standards, and that can take a lot of that time out of that development process, which is really, really expensive, and creates the risk that makes it difficult, and risk drives up cost.
Any other comments from panelists about what the city can do to assist? No. Mr. Liss?
I mean, I would agree that anything the city can do on its operational side to speed projects through the pipeline is always appreciated. We always, when we're working in the city, we say, well, how fast are they? How slow are they? Like, which departments are going to hold you up, which aren't? We've been really lucky to have a great partnership in the city of Alameda, and we would support anything to speed us through, and more money.
Okay.
I want to just add a little bit too. I mean, I think without standards, or with subjective or standards, the process can get abused. We very often see design review hold up projects for extended period of time, and the real motive there is not an issue over what color the building is or what type of material the building is. It's really trying to use a process that may be more difficult to establish standards around, and use that to try to kill a project, because ultimately time will kill a project. And so trying to come up with design review standards and not allowing them to be abused will help us get more housing.
There was, and I'll just quickly say, there was just a bill passed out of the legislature that's on the governor's desk, sponsored by Senator Nancy Skinner from the East Bay here, and SB 330 that would make the approval process for developers more certain by locking in the fees and the various permits required for a particular development at an earlier point in the development process than has been currently the case. I'm not a developer. Andy, do you remember, or Louis, do you remember exactly what that point is?
Yeah, I don't actually, but we're supportive of the Skinner's bill.
Yeah, so
Did you say the bill was signed by the governor?
it has not yet
Oh, it
been
has not.
signed. It's on his desk.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're also supportive of AB, is it 1486, 1487, the regional?
Yeah, and then there were a couple of other large bills related to additional funding and land availability that were also passed through the legislature and are awaiting the governor's signature. AB 1487, should the governor sign it, would enable the creation of a housing finance authority for the Bay Area that would allow MTC and ABAG, that are now becoming one organization, they used to be two, to put a housing finance measure on the ballot in the 9-county Bay Area, and everyone in 9 counties would vote on it. And if that measure received the 2/3 majority needed for passage across the 9 counties, then it would go into effect, as if the governor signs it. And then AB 1486 is a bill that was co-sponsored by my organization, EBHO, that clarifies provisions of the State Surplus Land Act, which there's a state law, the Surplus Land Act, that says that public entities, cities, counties, transit agencies, school districts, if they have public land that is surplus, that they're not using, they can't just sell it on the private market to the highest bidder. They need to offer it first to affordable housing developers for the development of affordable housing. There were some loopholes in the existing law, and it was unclear to some cities what surplus meant and if they had to comply and various things like that. And this bill clarifies some of the terminology, makes clear what compliance looks like, and we're hopeful that it could result in more land being made available for affordable housing development, which, while not free, as we've discussed with public land, would be cheaper, more cost-effective for developers than having to buy land on the private market. Yeah.
Okay. And moving on to the next question. If the incentives for affordable ADUs, what is it, affordable development units? Is that ADUs?
Accessory dwelling units.
Sorry, okay. Law is signed by the governor. What incentives would you suggest?
Well, I could, so you said affordable ADUs? Okay, so I would first say that Barry Council is a huge advocate for accessory dwelling units, and I was really sad to hear that in 8 years, Alameda only issued 2 ADU permits, but I know that's changed since the ADU ordinance has been amended in 2017. But there's been a lot of barriers that have been removed with this past legislative session that will hopefully be signed by the governor. And just at large, ADUs are considered a naturally affordable form of housing. They're affordable by design, simply because they are a form of gentle infill that leverages existing infrastructure, and their size are compact. They don't use as much energy as like a large McMansion by comparison's sake. So some of the things that we could hopefully look for next year are lowered impact fees. If the ADU is less than 750 square feet, those fees would be waived. And then above that, it'll be proportional to the size of the primary house. Also that makes it difficult right now is this owner occupancy requirement, where the owner has to either live in a primary house or in the ADU. There's a lot of people who travel a lot or what have you, and they're not necessarily living in their home, so that makes it much more flexible for a lot of us renters. And something that's really exciting is AB 68 and AB 81, which would allow essentially upzoning of all single-family land. California, 60% of California's land is zoned for single-family homes. And at this point in this housing crisis, it doesn't really, I think we have to really assess the logic of putting one home on a single lot and not taking advantage of all this underutilized space. And so this would allow for an ADU and a junior ADU. So in a sense, having 3 homes and 1 lot. So all of these are hopefully things that we can look forward to. And I guess specifically to the question about affordable, again, these are affordable by design, but there's another legislation, AB 670 by Assemblymember Friedman, that would require cities to come up with some kind of incentives to provide those homes for lower income occupants. So whether that's a forgivable loan or what have you, there are some packages that we could look forward to next year.
Okay. Next question. What percentage of the people who work in Alameda can afford to live here? How does this compare with the number of affordable units in new and proposed developments? Anybody know the answer? What percentage of the people who work in Alameda can afford to live here?
I actually don't know the answer to this question off the top of my head. I'd have to go look it up.
I think what I once saw the statistic for a smaller city in Massachusetts, and it wasn't actually how many people can work here, can afford to live here. It's how many people who live here now could afford to live here now if they entered the market at this moment. So existing renters or maybe homeowners who bought at a lower price. This was Somerville, Massachusetts, which probably has some things in common with Alameda. It was like the vast majority of people who live in Somerville can't afford to live in Somerville. So it'd be interesting to see that statistic.
I don't know how to answer the question either, but I do know that people who work here want to live here. That is, we spend a lot of our days recruiting companies to our projects in Alameda, and, I can't de-link my business anymore from housing. It's a very integral part of the success in recruiting good jobs to Alameda. It's, can this community provide housing? And is there enough of housing to provide the things that businesses need? We have 2 business parks built in what I'll call the homogeneous suburban business park model. That model is outdated, and the model now is integrating live, work, and play. And businesses want homes close to where they are located so that their employees can have a better quality of life and not spend 2 hours commuting each way. Businesses want services, amenities, transit. Businesses alone can't support that. One of the challenges we have at Harbor Bay Business Park, we are close to a residential community, but it's a relatively low density community. It's somewhat isolated in terms of its access, so we don't have an evening and weekend population to support amenities, and that's why we don't have amenities. But what a great location for businesses to locate, but it leaves us having to compete very often on a lower cost pricing model because we can't offer some of those other things that businesses want. And so I do think housing, we can improve, and then we can improve a lot of things here. More people who live and work here, less traffic, people not having to needing to get off the island in the morning.
I'll just make a couple quick comments to that. I don't know the answer to Alameda specifically, but the Bay Area Council does an annual poll, and the number's been increasingly more about, I think it's now 46% of Bay Area residents are looking to leave the region just because they can't afford to live here, they can't afford the quality of life. And I think a big indicator of the cost of living is housing, so the more we could deliver more homes overall, and especially low and middle income housing, the more that'll benefit our region. And we also need to think about the other side of the equation of providing more opportunities for lower and middle income workers. How can we provide more job opportunities that don't require a college degree, et cetera? So these are all the various elements that we need to do to address our quality of life.
Thank you. Next question for Mr. Ernst. Some housing advocates argue that even if we can't fund affordable housing, increasing our inventory of market rate housing will, over time, reduce the cost of housing. Is this true in the Bay Area?
I firmly believe it's true, but I do think it's a regional and not just a city matter. But I do believe ultimately that more supply ultimately would allow us to build at all levels without heavy subsidy. But we are way behind, and so that would require us to really crank up the supply fast. This economy, this region generates a lot of jobs, and we just don't keep up with it. And at some point, that job generation ability will lose that, I think, if this housing crisis persists. So I think we can, but it's got to be region-wide, and it's got to happen quickly.
I'm gonna disagree with that just slightly to say that while I think that obviously we need more affordable homes, we need more production, building more homes, while it may help kind of on the margins to reduce the price, the cost just a little bit, it's not going to help significantly. Obviously, if we do it regionally, it'll help more, but housing is not housing is not a good, and it is not a market like other markets. Oftentimes with housing, when you create supply, you're also creating demand. So that means that the price doesn't go down just because you built 100 more houses, doesn't mean that price correspondingly is going to go down for everyone else, because you build, some lovely houses in a really lovely part of the region, and all of a sudden people want to move there to live in that really lovely part of the region. That increases the price for other folks that currently live there. So I'm not saying it's not totally not true, but I think it's more complicated than if we build more, the price will go down. Yes, and we've got to do a whole lot of other things. We got to protect people, we got to preserve what we have, we got to find new ways to build more efficiently, and we need more money to help with the subsidy that we need.
And production's really focused right now on the high end of the market, so low, moderate end is not really being addressed.
His comment was that production is really focused on the high end, not on the moderate or low end. Joe, did you have another comment?
Yeah, when I talk about supply, I don't talk about 100 units in a nice region. I'm talking about every community meeting its RHNA objectives, and RHNA objectives having a catch-up factor built into it. I mean, we generate a lot of jobs, and we need to build housing, but it should also be the right kind of housing. It should be housing that promotes transit, housing that supports transit systems. It should be not housing that requires or allows, each home to have 3 cars and everybody leaving in a single occupant vehicle for their jobs. It should be close to our jobs so we could take other means to get to work. But when I talk about supply, I'm thinking big supply.
Which, just one more point on RHNA. Joe talked about RHNA needing to have a catch-up factor in it. This RHNA cycle upcoming, I'm fairly confident is going to have a catch-up factor. The current RHNA numbers for the city of Alameda for the 8 years were 1,723 units. That number is going to go up, for not just for Alameda, but for all the cities in the region, for especially the small cities or smaller cities, for a number of reasons. One being that in the last RHNA cycle, they actually made the numbers lower than they would have normally because of the lingering effects of the recession. They knew that the region was still not back to baseline economic conditions, and so they made those numbers lower. Those numbers are going to go up for that reason. They're going to go up in the smaller cities because historically 40 to 45% of the RHNA allocations in Alameda County, in the Bay Area, have been absorbed by the 3 large cities of San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose. And so when we talk about the region needing to do its part and every part of the region needing to do its part, That means that the smaller cities, including Alameda, are going to be asked to do more. And I talked a little bit earlier about some of those other factors about looking at fair housing and not wanting to concentrate certain ethnic or income populations in one part of the region for furthering fair housing. We're going to want to have more housing for lower income groups in communities that have more services, more supports, places like Alameda, other more suburban cities in our region. So the numbers will be going up. So whatever the challenge is feeling like now, it's going to feel a little bit more pressure before it gets better, most likely.
Okay.
So, sorry, do you mind if I just make a couple quick comments to this theme? One, I totally agree that we need more realistic reading numbers. Unfortunately, it's been politicized for the past few cycles. Beverly Hills, they actually reached their reading numbers, and guess how many units that was? Yeah. Wow, gold star. Good job, Beverly Hills. So we are due for doubling, tripling our responsibility and doing our fair share in terms of housing production. We're decades behind, 40 years behind in delivering homes. There is a severe housing shortage, so I agree that we need, again, housing at all levels of affordability. Since the 1980s, we're supposed to do 180,000 units annually in the state, and consistently it's been 80,000 or less. Last year, I think it was 77,000 units. So there's no denying the facts that we're just underwhelmingly behind, and this is hurting everyone in the Bay Area. But I also agree that we need two parallel efforts. To Sophia's point, the 3 Ps are really important. We do need to preserve our affordable housing stock. We need to protect tenants because we are so behind. It's going to take some time for these housing prices to soften. So in the meantime, bills like AB 1482, which would allow protection for tenants for, I think it's a 10-year time period. But again, we also need to produce more homes, lots and lots of homes.
So I want to move away from RENA for a minute. And this question is for Mr. Ernst, but anybody can answer. Is Alameda, consisting of 3 islands and a low-lying peninsula, incapable of safely housing more people? Can the city safely evacuate people from Site A and other new developments on short notice for a tsunami or a firestorm resulting from gas lines broken in an earthquake? Do safety concerns dictate what we build for more housing?
I think we've always got to take safety into consideration. I think that should be part of any plan, but it shouldn't deter us from building more housing. I mean, when you see people living in tents along the street, are we saying that's acceptable because we are fearful of a tsunami? I have a hard time with that. I think, I think we need to plan for those things and build appropriately and build the right types of housing and build, the right volume of housing. There's many benefits from that. It's not just creating more units to house people, but it also, more housing can support building more of those things necessary to create levees to protect us for sea level rise and tsunamis and build the appropriate infrastructure that's safe and develop transit systems that can move people around. And you can't ignore safety, of course not, but it should not deter us from more building.
Okay. The next question for Mr. Liss. Why are senior units so expensive to build? Are they studio apartments or larger? Is it more expensive to build in Alameda than, say, Oakland?
That's a great question. The senior units are actually a little more affordable to build than the family units. Our senior units are ones and twos, and our family units are ones, twos, and threes. So the larger the unit, the more expensive, the more square footage you're building. I would say costs are pretty comparable between Oakland and Alameda from what I'm hearing. But every project is going to have different minutia. I would say right now what's really cool is that because we're the first building up, we do sort of have the luxury of spreading out as we construct. And I know things can get a little hairier when you're on a tighter site, so it should be fun when we build the second building.
Any other comments on building costs? Well, we're getting close to the end of the program. I want to thank all of our panelists for participating in the program. I think it's raised a lot of questions. I think we have some answers, but clearly there's a lot more to explore here. I also want to thank you, the audience, for coming and for some great questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to answer all of them, but the panelists may be here for a few more minutes, so please feel free to come up and talk to them. We're planning 2 additional forums this fall. One later this month, presented by the League of Women Voters State Executive Director Helen Hutchinson, about commercial property tax, or Schools and Communities First, to raise an additional $11 billion a year for schools and communities. Mrs. Hutchinson's presentation will be in 3 weeks on the 24th. Our third program this fall is How to Count All Californians in the 2020 Census, and possibly changes to the Alameda, and additionally, possible changes to the Alameda Charter will be on November 14th, and we're partnering with the city on the census presentation. So I encourage everybody to come, because the census is an extremely important topic, as is the Schools and Communities First. And so now I think the forum is over, and thank you all, and let's give a round of applause for our presenters.